Okay. Oh, a few more people coming in, but I think we're going to get going. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. We're going to talk about universal digital rights and digital inclusion today, amongst many other things. My name is Jason Carrion. I'm the finance editor at Quartz in London, and I'm joined by a very illustrious panel here today to hash out what should be included in universal digital rights, how feasible that is to enforce them, to construct them, all that kind of stuff. And I think it's interesting that we're talking about rights and inclusion in this in the kind of same session, because something that's quite interesting, I think, as you know, the next billion people come online is whether they want whether they want to be part of the web that we have today, and then stepping back, whether we want to be part of the web we have today. I think with GDPR and kind of other privacy and data management issues, this is a very live issue. Being at the OECD, we're talking about universal rights. This is what we want to think as globally as possible. We have a poll question we should put up with on your seats. There should be something that explains how you use the BCast system. Basically, I think this is a pretty uncontroversial question, but is it desirable to have universal digital rights? Let's ask that now. There's a follow-up question later that's a bit trickier, but let's just get kind of a baseline of who in this room thinks whether it's a desirable remedy to address the challenges, privacy, freedom of expression, connectivity, all that kind of stuff. So answer that. However you answer that on the BCast system, and we'll get that going before we talk. So the UN Declaration of Human Rights does address this to a certain extent. 2016, they there was an addendum saying that the same rights that people have offline should also be protected online. That includes freedom of thought, conscience, the right to privacy, that kind of thing. And also, as we all probably know in this room, GDPR, which took effect in the EU last week, enshrines a number of fairly strict rights around the right to be informed about how your data is being used. You have to opt in, et cetera, et cetera. In that sense, I think the EU is leading the world, but there's probably more we can do to make this more universal. So I'm going to introduce our panelists as I sort of ask them an opening question. And I want to start with Rebecca McKinnon, who's from Ranking Digital Rights, which is very on the nose for this topic, which is terrific. The thing that you are particularly interested in, Rebecca, and tell us a bit about what Ranking Digital Rights does, but it's about how tech is designed, managed, and governed in a way that is compatible with human rights, social justice, and economic inclusion. That is an enormous sort of goal that you have. But tell us how you rank digital rights and how you've done it with a lot of the big tech companies that we know.
Sure. Thanks. So we actually look at a slice. We produce something called the Corporate Accountability Index, and we're just evaluating 22 of the world's most powerful internet, mobile, and telecommunications companies, and really taking a sample of companies that, when you add them together, they affect the digital lives of most people on the planet. But to back up a little bit about what we're evaluating, digital rights are really human rights in our view. There's not some special set of digital rights that are only digital. Basically, it's our view that human rights, as enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the two covenants, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and then also the International Covenant on Economic and Social Rights, all of those rights apply in relation to lives that we currently lead that are very intertwined between physical and digital. We call the index, or we call the project, Ranking Digital Rights, because we want to make clear that as we're evaluating companies, we're not evaluating labor practices or conflict minerals and other things that are traditionally evaluated by other sort of business and human rights research projects. So there's something called the Corporate Human Rights Benchmark that looks at the manufacturing sector and is very much evaluating labor practices and so on. We don't do that. We just look at basically the rights of users in communities that are impacted by these digital technologies rather than the labor. So that's one reason, just to be clear, we don't actually believe there are special digital rights that are somehow different than human rights in the physical space. Our lives extend into the digital, and therefore our human rights extend into the digital. With ranking digital rights, we're just looking at two rights. There are many other rights, but freedom of expression and privacy are often considered, even before the internet, were considered enabling rights for many other rights. And in the digital world, when people are so dependent on internet platforms and network digital services, freedom of expression and privacy, and how companies exercise power over what you can see, what you can't see, what you can communicate, what you can't communicate, becomes all the more important. As is the company serving as kind of a bottleneck and gatekeeper for who knows what about you, both in terms of the companies and also governments and also hackers, right? Criminals who get your information. And so the responsibility of companies to be accountable for how your rights are respected and protected through these privately operated services is very important. And in the view of many people in the human rights community, there's insufficient accountability and transparency. So we're just looking at when we evaluate, and you can go to rankingdigitalrights.org. I'm not going to take up too much time explaining the whole project because I'll take up everybody's time. But if you go to rankingdigitalrights.org and look at the project, one thing that will strike you very clearly is we're not looking, the companies that score the highest, and the highest score are Ds, and most people fail, but the companies that score the highest, this is kind of like they're even failing. If you get a high score, you're just kind of meeting the baseline. It's a floor, not a ceiling. We're just looking for baseline disclosure about how the company's policies and practices are affecting users' rights so that users can make basic informed choices about how they're using the services and understand how their information environment is being shaped by these companies. It's kind of the baseline minimum is what we're evaluating, not best ideal practice, actually. And most of them are failing even at baseline minimum commitment and disclosure. That's right. That's what we're evaluating, essentially.
Great. Thank you. I want to talk to Julia Hobsbawm next, who's just to my right here, with which, if you get her business card, has a number of titles on it, which is very very impressive. But author, visiting professor at Cass Business School, and is working on something around social health at Thrive Global, which is Arianna Huffington's new startup. And has thought a lot about digital rights and health online, that sort of thing, and about connecting with purpose, which is something that you wrote recently. And what I want to do is I want to kind of turn something that you wrote recently into a question for you to answer, which is, how have we reached a stage where data is harvested voraciously by organizations with a breathtaking sense of entitlement and no sense of privacy? How indeed have we got there, Julia?
Well, we got there through network effects. We've gotten there through the scale-free properties of the internet, which in scientific terms mimic only that of an epidemic. So you have a sort of weaponized system of communication that it expands and is not really controllable. But you also have, I believe, a human response to technology which is controllable and containable and can be altered, which is we've outsourced our own way of doing things as humans to a much bigger scaled way of operating, which doesn't just come from machines, it actually comes from Silicon Valley, telling us that scale and speed is the norm, that growth is the right way to conduct relationships. And databases, which are now the subject of quite a lot of regulatory interest, they are actually people bases. They are, you know, they are hardware systems and software systems to contain information about people. And So I'm interested in reframing that discussion, which is, yes, if you're a policymaker, yes, if you're a corporation, yes, if you are out of necessity interested in scale and speed to protect your people or to grow their human rights, how do you nevertheless do so in a way that has a sort of realpolitik at the heart of it, that isn't about just saying, okay, well, you sign it once and you don't really know what you're signing, and then we've got you forever. The final point I'd make, because I'm really keen to hear from everybody else and from the audience, the final point I'd make is that we have an inherent set of contradictions at the moment in this internet era, which is something that structurally is completely democratic and free, has nevertheless been made a monopolistic vehicle. And that's both a threat, but it's also an opportunity. It's a moment for us to say, well, hang on a minute. And in fact, obviously, I'd love you all to read my book, but I also think you should read Jeff Mulgan's book, which is in the bookshop, Big Mind, where he has a very interesting chapter about commons and how information and knowledge is pretty much the definition of what a commons and a public-owned commodity is. So the public own knowledge and information, and we need to make sure that we are living up to our responsibilities as consumers and as gatekeepers, and to keep the human scale.
Fascinating. I'm going to turn now to Philip Jennings, who's the General Secretary of UNI Global Union, very large umbrella group of labor unions. Philip, on this idea about the digital rights that we have, I wanted to bring you in to talk a bit about how that works with workers, and to start with, that's your constituency. Here in France, there's the right to switch off, which is kind of a type of sort of like anti-digital right, I guess you could say, and also the rights that workers have vis-a-vis like their employers sort of surveilling them or collecting their data. What's the current thinking from your perspective on how those rights work vis-a-vis workers? Grab that mic there.
Thank you. Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for the invitation. First of all, human rights are trade union rights, and as Rebecca said, they extend into the digital domain, into the digital realm, into digital enterprises. I have a number of comments to make about how and where they apply. First of all, at the workplace, freedom of association applies to the digital world. The right to associate, the right to express yourself as a worker, the right to negotiate a collective agreement. I hope Jeff Bezos is listening, because he is in breach of those fundamental human and trade union rights which were agreed 70 years ago and even longer in the International Labour Office. We are seeking to extend that realm of voice and agreement into the world of data protection and to surveillance, and indeed, as you mentioned, into the whole field of working time. I would like the platform world and the new digital platform world to understand that the scam of claiming that people are self-employed, independent, and they have no relationship to their work and their life and the control over them has to end. And therefore, the human right to organize, negotiate, and have a voice, and have your work valued, I think, is very, very important. Another area, jobs and the future of work. Therefore, I think every worker should have the right to learning throughout their working lives as a constitutional right, not something you do until the age of 16 or 18 or whatever it is, that for their working lives, we are going to invest in them and we're going to give them the digital right to advanced learning and adult learning. I also think it's very important in the business models that we have and these new digital giants, and there's not many of them at the end of the day, just 5 or 6, that they apply the UN's human rights and business principles of rights, remedy and respect. The UN guiding principles apply to them. They should not be alien to them. And therefore, they have to do their own due diligence, which is now a very powerful instrument here in France, that every company above a certain size has to do an operation of due diligence in the sense of looking at the adverse consequences on the human rights of their people as part of their business model. That could revolutionize the social models or the business models of these big companies. We have to respect the rights of journalists and freedom of expression. We have more journalists murdered, locked up, banged up, silenced in this world. And therefore, let's have this digital world and all the openness when it was first proclaimed that people have the right to freedom of expression. And above all, we must have the right as citizens not to have our democracies manipulated by private sector interests. It is now clear that this harvesting of data and the work that went into those business models was deeply and profoundly manipulative, maybe even addictive. Now, I'm not an expert on this stuff, but when someone has the profiles of 230 million people, which can be used to manipulate their sense and their judgment and also their impulsiveness, we got something to worry about. So we have a right to protect our democracies and also to shape the direction that the digital revolution is taking. Our voice must not be silent. We must not just simply accept this as de facto. We have to make our voices heard. We have to put the humans back in the center of the discussion, and we have the opportunity to shape this revolution. And it will only be shaped if we change the way that business behaves. We have a human right, a democratic right, to try and change the way that business functions towards an era of responsible business conduct. And with all of that, we'll have a much better world to work and live in. Thank you.
Okay. Well, Virginia Eubanks, tough act to follow there. But he mentioned, Philip mentioned the digital giants, and when we talk these days about data privacy, about data management, about digital rights, we tend to think of the Googles, the Facebooks, et cetera, et cetera. Your work focuses on the technology that is perhaps imposed, that you're not you don't sign up for an account when it comes to the government or police or these sorts of things. Can you talk a bit about rights in that context and the work you've done there?
Sure. I think it really matters in this context who the we is in that sentence, right? So we say when we talk about digital rights, we tend to talk about privacy. I think we're often assuming that the we in that sentence is users of social media or as policymakers or other folks who have a very particular, a very unique relationship to data systems. And so I've spent the last 8 years reporting in communities of poor and working class people across the United States to talk to them about how new digital tools are being integrated into public services in the United States. So I've done work around an attempt to automate all of the eligibility processes for the welfare system in the state of Indiana. A system that advocates call the Match.com of homeless services, which is the coordinated entry system, which is supposed to match the most vulnerable unhoused people with the most appropriate available housing in Los Angeles County. And also I've reported on a statistical model that is supposed to be able to predict which children might be victims of abuse or neglect in the future in Allegheny County, which is where Pittsburgh is in the state of Pennsylvania in the United States. And I think one of the key things for this conversation to take out of my work is that when we assume that the holders of rights are users of these systems, or people who choose to engage in these systems, we erase power in a way that is incredibly damaging to a thoughtful consideration of rights. So the folks who I speak to in the United States especially don't really have a meaningful right to not be part of the systems they're part of. So okay, you could turn down food stamps in the United States, but if you have a family and you're turning down your food stamps, that's actually textbook child neglect, and then Child Protective Services can take your children from you. Right? So this isn't a meaningful a right to not engage with these systems. And so one of the things that I'm really interested in having a conversation about today and for the rest of my life, potentially, is how are these systems used as systems of social control? And what does that mean when we talk about inclusion being the goal? What does it mean to ask people to include themselves in systems that profile, punish, and police them?
Sinister implications there. Yeah, very, very interesting. And then finally at the end here, Rand Hindi, who's the founder and CEO of Snips, Snips.ai, which is a very interesting French startup, maybe not a startup anymore, five years, European startup, excuse me. He has a very interesting perspective on this, I think, because, again, when we're talking about companies in terms of the way that they collect and use and harvest, all these kind of sinister terms, data. You and your company took a very different approach, and from the beginning, you were telling me part of the business model is that you don't collect any data. You don't have users per se. Can you just explain a bit about that? And then also, I guess the fundamental question here is, there's a lot of grumbling about GDPR and all the kind of restrictions and costs of complying with greater privacy, right to be forgotten, all that kind of stuff. Can it be a source of competitive advantage? Can it be a useful part of a business model? Tell us.
So first, I think it's very important to keep in mind that it's always going to be convenience over privacy when it comes to services. If there is no alternative that exists that guarantees privacy, somehow people will actually trade off. We've been doing this with messaging for years until messaging apps started becoming encrypted. And today, if you're building a messaging app, you'd be crazy not to offer encryption as a feature, because the perception shifted once the alternative existed. However, when it comes to artificial intelligence in particular, data is how you actually build those AIs. And so for a very long time, actually forever, companies have been telling us that you need to make a choice between privacy and some kind of smart artificial intelligence. But this is actually not true. It turns out that most of those AI that we're building could be built without access to individual users' data, or without centralizing this data into one massive server, or by using some new modern cryptographic techniques. And so I think it's very important to realize that with the current technology, there is effectively no reason to ask people to give away 100% of their privacy just to build something better. You can actually have both at the same time.
So your company works in the kind of voice controlled AI space. There's a big company who's involved in that. Philip took their name in vain earlier. Do you think that your approach here, that we don't collect your data, that kind of stuff, that is an important differentiator for you when you're competing against Alexa or Google Home or whatever that?
I think there is a fundamental shift in the demand for privacy. I mean, how many people here care about privacy? Okay, but let me ask you, how many people here actively try to protect their privacy? Well, okay, well, maybe this is a biased audience, I guess, right?
Liars, all of you.
So most people don't, and I think it's important that we have to keep in mind that we should not be asking the average consumer or the average person to care about privacy, but not because it's not important, but because it's our job as companies to make sure we guarantee privacy by design. And so it's really about a mindset when you're building a company, rather than trying to just change your privacy policy like so many people have been doing recently, right? It's really about how you build from the ground up to be a viable business without needing to monetize personal data. So in our case, we did a very simple thing, is we actually built our technology so that it runs locally on the device you're talking to. So when you're speaking to our voice assistant, the machine you're talking to does the processing, and no data is ever sent outside. So that means nobody can actually effectively listen to you. But then people are asking, how do you train the AI if you don't have any data? That's often what bigger companies will tell you have to trade off. Well, we invented a way to create fake data. So basically, we have people and machines around the world pretending to use the product and essentially acting as potential users. And we use this fake data to train the AI. And guess what? That actually works even better because you can control the quality and the type of data you can generate. And so overall, we ended up having equivalent performances to every other AI that you have from the other competitors without ever needing to collect data from the actual users.
Interesting. And because this is 2018, there's also the blockchain involved, so we just have to get that out of the way. So yeah, go ahead, Julia.
Well, I love that. So we there's a silver lining. You don't have fake. You hate fake news, but you love fake data. That is very good. But I mean, my concern is there is no such thing as safe big tech. In fact, it was I think it was an Alexa last week recorded the conversation of somebody and his wife, and there was a whole series of technical missteps, and Alexa then emailed a colleague of the husband to relay something, you know, which was the equivalent of the Uber driverless car crashing and killing somebody. I mean, this stuff goes wrong. And we have, as a society, I think your point is absolutely well made about the actual danger to liberty, to life, to freedom of technology being embedded in everything. And so the question is, how do you try and turn the tap off? I don't think you can do that. We have to have a big cultural shift, just like we have done around our physical and our mental health, which is why I call my stuff social health, because there is a model that we can follow. 70 years ago, there wasn't a $3.7 trillion market and culture around wearing your physical fitness and living it and, you know, da-da-da, and there is now. We need to build a similar set of, if you like, alternative values, rather than trying to put the genie back in the bottle. Because I think Scott McNealy, the founder of Sun Microsystems, was right when he said in 2009, you have zero privacy, get over it. You're not going to get privacy back, in my view. I mean, you can have better behavior, that can be a USP, but I don't believe we have any more privacy. There's too much surveillance going on. There's too much collection of that data that can be subverted innocently or not innocently. I don't know what you guys think.
Most services have not yet been created. I think, you know, I agree with you, it's very hard to actually get back privacy from existing services we use, right? This is actually where I think governments can come in and force these big companies to shift, because they will probably not do it by themselves. But for new companies who are going to be building the future use cases, I think that they can build it from the ground up to actually protect privacy. And I agree, it's a change in mindset. But if anything, there's going to be more demand for privacy as we digitalize everything in our lives, not less. Like, people care more today than they cared before because they have more at stake.
Philip, yours picked up there.
What's your take on how do you get to grips with artificial intelligence? As a global organization, we produce some basic principles on the ethics of artificial intelligence. And we say things like humans in control. We talk about the black box. We talk about transparency and accessibility. How viable do you see that argument from the various places that you are coming from? Is it simply too late?
So I think artificial intelligence is very easy to imagine that it can do everything. My belief, I've been doing AI for 15 years. I was a researcher in AI before. Like, that's my thing. I just got lucky that it became hot. But effectively, I've been doing this for a long time.
Before it was cool.
A machine is a machine. If you don't like it, you unplug it. That's it. And artificial intelligence, even if you project yourself in 10, 15 years with artificial general intelligence, will always be limited to logical tasks. However, we know that as humans, a large number of our decisions involve emotional decision making. If I'm asking you, do you prefer to eat chicken or fish for lunch, there is no logical way to answer that question. You know, you feel like chicken. A machine, however smart it is, cannot make that decision. And so I think it's important when we're thinking about the future of AI and how that impacts people, we need to think about how we're going to actually shift towards work that is mostly logical, algorithmic-based work to emotional-based work. And so, you know,
but that's not the world of work that we all live in. We live in an emotional world of work. We live in a spontaneous world of work.
Yeah, but that's
and with the AIs being used, you know, the bias has been proved. Discriminating practices have been shown.
I agree.
From hiring and firing to performance appraisal.
Indeed. And
so how do we take back control?
So biases in AI is the real risk, in my opinion. I'm not worried about AI taking over people. That's never going to happen. That's never going to happen. You're always going to be able to pull the plug. However, using AI everywhere, so what? Yeah, right?
But what if the robots come to the rescue of the robots?
Well, okay, so we're getting very meta in the discussion. I'm actually publishing very soon an article specifically explaining why artificial human intelligence is impossible and why effectively you're going to more have a cohabitation of AI doing logical stuff and human doing emotional stuff, which, by the way, emotional intelligence is superior to logical intelligence in the workplace in general. because that's where most of the decision actually come from. And I also do think that that's going to actually favor women in the workplace in the future. But
Okay, yeah, go ahead.
Can I,
real quick.
Rebecca? Can I? Thank you. So this is the point at which I find it really great to stop being abstract and start talking about people's actual lives right now. One of my frustrations with the conversations we often have around these technologies is that we sort of live in the world of the future of what will happen, what's going to happen, or this idea, this sort of old William Gibson quote, right? The future has arrived. It's just not well distributed. I actually agree with him, but for the opposite reason that I think he means. I think what Gibson means is that the future has already arrived, but sort of rich people in rich countries get the good stuff first. I believe that the future has already arrived, but it's actually already arrived in marginalized communities, in places where people, what I call in the book, low rights communities, places where people's human rights are already under attack. And they feel like either they have to trade some of their basic human rights for other rights, they have to trade their privacy for food, for example, or they don't feel like they have a meaningful power base to exert the existing rights they have. And so the reason this is coming up for me is, let me give you an example. I would love for that to be true, that emotional labor is going to become the great Provence of human workers. But in the reporting I did for Automating Inequality, actually what well, they're not quite artificial intelligences, but what the automated decision-making systems that I studied do is replace the workers who do emotional work, replace the most female, the most diverse, and the most working class part of the workforce, which is frontline caseworkers. And it's done under the name of decreasing bias, right? Because humans are seen, their human decision-making is seen as being opaque and unknowable, and machine-based decision-making is seen as being transparent and clear. In fact, in my book, I argue that it's the opposite, right? That often these technologies are quite hard to understand how they're making decisions.
Then we should not, like, it depends how you imagine things, but this is clearly a mistake. Trying to automate emotional tasks with a machine will lead to inefficiencies long term.
Right, but if you think in terms of power, you know the people whose jobs are going to go are not the economists and the data scientists, they're the caseworkers. They are the people who do emotional work who are under attack by these systems. At least that's what happened in my reporting. And I want to make one other point about the data, and then I'll pass the mic. But I'd love to hear your story about using fake data. It's actually really useful, because one of the things that came up in the predictive model that's supposed to be able to predict abuse or neglect is that they're working with this incredibly limited data set, which is only about people who reach out for help from public programs. And when I asked the head of sort of data analytics in Allegheny County if they understood how that made poor and working families feel like they were being targeted and surveilled, she said, oh yeah, absolutely. All the data we have are biased against the poor. We'd love to have private data, but we know we're never going to get access to, say, private health insurance data. And so just what I want to suggest is the way that data flows has everything to do with who has power and who does not. And so, yeah, I'd love to bring the conversation back to these things that we think are universal human rights and how we can express them through these tools in, like, how people are actually living their lives right now.
Rebecca, you've been very patient.
Sure, yeah, well, I want to build on some things that Julia said, but everybody really. One of the things that I've been looking at for a number of years, since before I started ranking digital rights, is the question of impact assessments, and also this issue of how do you institutionalize accountability so that it's not personalized. So what I think we've observed for couple of decades now is that you have a company that starts out with the CEO and the founders saying, we're really good people, we're setting up this company to do good things, we won't be evil, et cetera, and then over time, things they didn't think of happen badly. And so there's a lot to be said for, even if you're starting a company with the best of intentions and believing you're really on the side of the angels, how do you red team that, right? How do you do impact assessment to hold yourself accountable for all the things you didn't think of that are going to go wrong? over time? And then how do you build systems also for when you move on and somebody else replaces you and the company gets much bigger and there's many layers of management, that across the company people are acting according to the same values, and that there are checks in place to ensure that policies are being adhered to, but that decisions are being made based on those values. And is the company going to be willing to subject itself also to external evaluation to make sure it's not going off the rails or not thinking of the bad data and how it's biased? And similarly, we have a problem, I think, with governments when putting these things in place, not doing impact assessment. We require environmental impact assessments when there's any kind of public infrastructure project, but we're not doing kind of, you know, human rights, civil liberties impact assessments on these types of systems, and we absolutely need them.
Rebecca, just to follow up, did anything that Rand say about the way that his company approaches privacy and data and all that kind of, is that reflected in any of the big companies that you've studied in your ranking report, or no?
Well, I think the thing about his company that's different and better, I would say, is he's starting out thinking about how does my business model, you know, protect these rights, right? And in that sense, for today, you know, he's starting out in a much better place than the legacy companies who are now having to kind of reverse engineer respect for things they weren't thinking about. They were thinking about other things, yeah, but not this. And so it's possible that there are other things he hasn't thought about yet because they haven't become issues that will be issues that he'll kind of regret that he hadn't thought about. And so how do you kind of, yeah, just put that system in place to catch these things early before you get hauled in front of the European Parliament and U.S. Congress and having to apologize for not having thought of things, right? Whether, you know, so.
I mentioned this point about manipulation in the democratic process. I mean, we're all influenced in the times of elections, but this degree of manipulation seems to be reaching a new kind of space where you're close to all of this, closer than me. Where do you see, how do you put that back in a place where the integrity of our democratic process is not questioned? And there's another point to this manipulation, is we see democratic spaces closing all over the place. When we look at freedom of association in the world, we have 59 countries that actually exercise violence and inflict violence on people like myself and civil society for what they're doing. We have more breaches of freedom of association in this particular period than we've seen in the post-war years. Collective bargaining infringements, 80% of the countries we studied show that there's an infringement of the right to negotiate, and then something like 80% interfere in the right to strike. What chance have we got then to talk about putting human rights in the digital domain when the human rights that we adopted 70 years ago are in what I would call a critical state?
Yeah, you've anticipated one of the questions that was coming in on Twitter. Does anybody want to respond to that?
Well, I slightly want to leap to the defense of the silico evangelists, bless them. I mean, I don't think it is entire conspiracy. I think there is a lot of cock-up. I actually think Mark Zuckerberg was sincere when he said, we just did not know how powerful our advertising was going to be. I think Google did know exactly what it was doing when it changed the algorithm on search. And I think Google has got away much more lightly than Facebook in terms of, you know, you really want an influence on information. The Google search rankings, I think, are probably, in the long term, more problematic than the insularity of Facebook. But the reason why I want to come slightly to the defense of Silicon Valley is you can't blame propaganda for being powerful, because we all use propaganda. Everyone wants to get their message across to the biggest audience possible. What's happened is that the mechanics just amplify it and make it very, very powerful. But the drivers of all of this remains the human. And in a way, we mustn't fantasize that, you know, we really are living in a world governed by robots. We're living in a world governed by us. and the human rights abuses are being done by individuals in government. That's what the trade union movement is all about. So I think we mustn't demonize the technology. The technology is used by the people, but our values are what needs to be explored and challenged. And those values are changing, which is why you now have a business that's growing based on privacy. I love that. I think fake data, that's got to be the idea of the forum.
I'm sure it's fake data, the people that keep ringing me up at home trying to sell all kinds of stuff.
Well, just to build on what Julie was saying, you know, targeted advertising and the business model around targeted advertising and the collection of data and sort of maximizing engagement around content that is the most controversial, of course, help to enable propaganda being so powerful. And some people have started to argue that targeted advertising is kind of like the fossil fuel for our information ecosystem. And if we really want an information ecosystem to be compatible with the kind of democratic and fair and just society we want, we need to move our business models for our information services away from targeted advertising as the primary fuel. And we need just as much innovation and investment and prioritizing. But as Julia says, it's a conscious choice. You know, we may have gotten here without thinking, just as we sort of got to climate change without thinking, but now we can do something. And so are we going to take responsibility for it? And it's not just Facebook, it's a whole host of media organizations who are now holier than thou and, you know, everything else. You know, everybody's got to take responsibility. And this is where when companies are coming forward and saying our business model is not on targeted advertising and we're doing something different, that's a very good sign.
Great, thank you. We have time for like one question. The most eager among you, if you want to get in on this discussion, which has been extremely lively, and I've tried to work in some from Twitter. Any questions in the audience for anyone here? All the way in the back, actually, on the left there. Here it comes.
Thank you. I was on my way out, but you know,
okay.
You caught me. So you've been talking about digital rights, and you said most of the responsibility is on companies, but are we setting up the wrong incentives here if we just take out the responsibility of individual? You haven't talked about that. How are individuals responsible for their own data protections? And you haven't said anything about that, because I'm thinking that the way we're moving, the direction we're moving, we're setting up the world for a bigger failure. And I don't know, but if we make people not aware of their own problems, then what happens in the future? It's for everybody there. Thanks.
I mean, for me, it's pretty clear that people shouldn't have to care. Like you should be able to care if you wanted to, and I think the GDPR does that very well by giving a lot more control on the user's hand. However, it's the job of companies and governments to make sure that the baseline guarantees privacy by design. I mean, if you have to think on a daily basis about every single human right that you have, and that you need to fight for every one of them on a daily basis, that's all you're going to do all day long, effectively. And so I think, it's just in the same way that nobody here, at least in France, I don't know, like, maybe I'm not going to say things like that, but, from the most perspective, you're pretty much allowed to see anybody you want and congregate and to speak about anything you want. You don't have to worry about that because that's kind of like guaranteed already. It should be the same thing with privacy. Like, privacy is one of these very few rights where we've been told that we didn't have full power, like full right to that. And I think this is what needs to change.
This segues into our conclusion, which we have another poll question. If we could just put that up and then go to kind of concluding remarks. It's about how feasible and practical it is to do this. So that may or may not appear at some point. And there was also a question that came in, which I want all of our panelists to maybe very briefly talk about, is what hope do we have in enforcing these rights, but also, which kind of gets at that point there, who should enforce them? We want to talk about like practical solutions here, the OECD. We're talking about universal rights, global, nature of things. I mean, who should enforce these rights? The gentleman was talking about taking an individual responsibility. We've talked about companies, we've talked about governments. maybe we just go down the line, and if there's any sort of closing remarks and thoughts about that. Philip, use the mic.
When it comes to the labour rights piece, there's a very well-trodden path at the International Labour Office. There is a system in place of global labour standards. There is a supervisory mechanism which comes under ferocious attack from the governments who are put under the microscope, and sometimes from the businesses who don't enjoy being exposed for their labour relations practices. What the UN has done with the principles business and human rights is very, very significant. And the fact that businesses have a responsibility here, and it will become generalized, I think, to do their due diligence, and for that to be subject to review, and also subject to remedy. The thing that's missing very often is what is the remedy that can be applied. We find the remedies at the International Labour Office somewhat soft, so therefore we have to go to the court of the remedy of public opinion, the remedy of investors not being pleased, the remedy of consumers being up in arms to try and change behaviour. My appeal would be to this sector and the new digital giants is get acquainted with that world of work, with those labour standards and with the principles of due diligence, and see how they apply to your day-to-day operations. And if they do this seriously and honestly, then there will be the space for auto-correct.
Great.
And that would not be a fake exercise. That would be a real one.
Okay, good. Very briefly, please. I want to give everyone else a chance.
Yeah, thank you. So I think particularly in the context of the United States that we are not terribly good at holding to basic economic human rights. And so we're not going to see that come necessarily from private sector or from the government. And it's really space for social movements to hold both the government and corporations accountable for their behavior and their impacts on people's lives.
Right.
Sure. Similarly, I would just reinforce that many governments are not only failing to protect rights, but violating them themselves, and often doing so deliberately via digital networks, censorship and surveillance. And so, like Virginia, I think because governments are failing, until we get to that utopian world where governments don't fail and implement responsible legislation, it is up to social movements, consumer movements, responsible investor movements, et cetera, to really globally coordinate and impose real consequences on entities that abuse power.
I'm a pessimistic optimist. So the pessimist in me says we're very far down the line. The optimist in me says there's always room for change. The one change I think we could make, we could demand, we could shine a spotlight on is the ridiculously, unenforceably long contracts that you're asked to click, I agree, to when you download an app, when you download your latest iOS installation. You guys, you all work in and around policy. Please put that to the European Commission, put that to the Senate, put that to the House of Commons. That is an infringement of basic digital rights, and we could and should fix that.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And I think, most people don't really realize what they're clicking on. So maybe as a conclusion, can we do a small 10 seconds experiment? Is that okay? Can everybody take their smartphone? You got to play the game. It doesn't work otherwise. Take your smartphone, unlock it, and open your last conversation, whatever that conversation is. All right? Now, I want you to give your phone to your neighbor. Try it. Come on. Pass it on. Actually give your phone to your neighbor. How does that feel? Right? That's exactly what happens when you click this OK button.
Okay.
You're giving someone you don't know access to your data, and that has to change. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. Thanks a lot for joining us. Thanks, OECD. Give your phones back.